stain. It's not my mother's fault.
This is my house. She's a maid.
Nobody wanted to face the rude veteran CEO until the maid's daughter took a stand. The penthouse of Colonel Walter Rothell, retired war hero turned ruthless CEO, gleamed with cold precision. Every surface shone, every rug aligned, every object placed with military perfection. Helen, the maid, moved quietly, polishing glass and straightening cushions, while her 12-year-old daughter Clara lingered in the doorway, clutching a worn notebook. Then, with calculated deliberation, the colonel tipped his steaming coffee mug. The black liquid spread like a battlefield wound across the pristine white rug. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his piercing gaze on Helen. "Careless," he barked. "Do it again, and you're out." Helen froze, her hands trembling. The colonel's medals, glinting from their frames on the wall, seemed to echo his authority. No one ever challenged him, not his employees, not his board, not even his family. His word was law, sharp and final. But Clara stepped forward, her small voice carrying more weight than the silence of the entire penthouse. "That's not true. You spilled it on purpose." The colonel's steel blue eyes locked on her. The room seemed to contract. Helen's face went pale, as though bracing for punishment. Clara swallowed hard, her heart pounding, but she remembered her grandfather's words, spoken over a folded flag. "Honor matters more than rank." "You should apologize to my mother," she said, her voice steadying, "because honor isn't about power. It's about truth." The colonel didn't speak. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, but for the first time in years, someone had fired back. The silence bristled with a single question. What would happen now that the untouchable veteran CEO had been defied by a maid's daughter? Colonel Walter Rothell's penthouse was less a home than a fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline like a conquest, every line of glass and steel mirroring the order he imposed on his life. His office, the heart of the residence, smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old leather. Maps from his campaigns in Vietnam hung alongside stock certificates and corporate charters. Every wall bore evidence of victories, both on the battlefield and in the boardroom. He was a man who never allowed chaos to breathe. His staff whispered about his temper in the elevators, their voices clipped with fear. Even the silent seemed trained to obey him. Into this world of rigid control stepped Helen and her daughter Clara. Helen had been in his employ for 6 years, her quiet diligence keeping her in place where others had fled after a month. Life had hardened her, lines etched deeply around her mouth, hands cracked from bleach and polish. But her spirit was soft. She bore the colonel's tirades without reply, knowing that the wages she earned were the only barrier between her daughter and the crushing debts of hospital bills left by her late husband's illness. Clara, at 12, carried herself with a gravity unusual for her age. Her dark hair fell in waves over a school uniform that was already fraying at the cuffs. She was clever, her notebooks filled with sketches, stories, and the names of historical figures her grandfather once told her about. Walter Mayhew had been a decorated sergeant, and Clara still clung to his memory like armor. While her mother lowered her eyes in submission, Clara's gaze often lifted, searching, questioning. To her, the colonel was a contradiction. She had overheard him on phone calls, his voice calm, even charismatic when speaking to investors. But in private, He barked orders like a drill sergeant. He moved with the precision of a soldier even now, decades after combat. His silver hair was cut in regulation style, his suits pressed so sharply they could have stood at attention. And yet, behind the unyielding facade, Clara sometimes glimpsed something else, a man pacing at night, staring at photographs of his unit, whispering names she did not know. Ethan Harrison, his son, was Clara's mirror in another world. The same age, but raised in privilege, Ethan attended private academies and was tutored by experts in every subject. And yet, for all his access to knowledge, he struggled. His marks fell, particularly in history, where the weight of dates and names crushed him. Clara once watched him sit at the grand dining table, his head bowed over a textbook, as his father's voice thundered from the study, "Do better, or I'll send you to Blackwood." Ethan's shoulders had quaked, but he never cried aloud. The penthouse itself reflected the gulf between these children. Clara's world was the narrow maid's corridor with its flickering light bulb and the pantry where she perched with her homework. Ethan's world was the library with its mahogany shelves, velvet chairs, and the quiet despair of expectations he could never meet. And binding them all was the Colonel, whose very presence shaped the air. His medals gleamed, but they were shadows of battles fought within. His staff feared him, his son revered and dreaded him, and Helen endured him. But Clara had dared to confront him. The pieces of the story were set like figures on a chessboard. The decorated veteran, the weary maid, the daughter with courage beyond her years, and the heir trembling under impossible standards. The only question that remained was how long the fragile balance could last before it broke. From the moment Clara defied him, Colonel Rothell shifted his gaze. Where before she had been little more than the maid's shadow, now she became an opponent in a silent war. He didn't raise his voice again, at least not at first. Instead, he began to test her. It started with small humiliations. A spill he blamed on her mother, though both of them knew it had been his hand that tipped the glass. A rug moved slightly out of place, for which he accused Helen of negligence. Clara would step forward, her fists balled at her sides, only to be silenced by her mother's quiet, desperate glance. "Not now," Helen's eyes pleaded. So Clara swallowed her fury, but each time it grew harder to contain. The Colonel watched these moments with the keen eye of a strategist. His office became his battleground. He would summon Helen and Clara, then sit behind his desk like a judge in uniform. His words were sharp, clipped, the same interrogation techniques he had once used in the jungles of Vietnam. He asked questions not to seek answers, but to unsettle. "How many steps did you take between the kitchen and the dining hall? Didn't notice? That's how mistakes are made. A soldier counts every step." Clara bristled. "We're not soldiers." His eyes narrowed, the faintest curl of a smile tugging his mouth. "Everyone is a soldier in my house." He devised chores impossible to complete perfectly, polishing the silver until it reflected without distortion, rearranging the bookshelves in alphabetical order, only for him to demand they be by color, then by size. Each change was another move in his game, watching for the moment when Clara would snap. Ethan observed from the shadows. Once, he passed Clara in the hall and whispered, "He's testing you. He does it to everyone." His voice was low, almost apologetic. Clara saw the fear in his eyes, and it steeled her resolve. She would not break as easily as the others, but the cruelty deepened. One afternoon, the colonel deliberately dropped a framed photograph of his unit. The glass shattered across the floor. He gestured to Helen. "Pick it up." Helen knelt, her hands trembling as she reached for the shards. A thin line of blood appeared on her palm. Clara lunged forward. "Stop it! You cut her on purpose!" The colonel leaned back in his chair, watching. "In war, you learn quickly that careless hands bleed. She should know better." Clara's voice shook, but she didn't retreat. "In war, men like my grandfather saved lives. You only humiliate people." The room went still. Helen's breath caught, Ethan froze, and even the colonel's face tightened at the mention of Walter Mayhew. For the first time his mask slipped just for an instant, then it returned, colder than ever. "You will come here every day," he said, his tone final. "You want to stand up for your mother? Then stand. Let's see how long you last." It was no longer employment. It was conscription. Helen bowed her head in silence, but Clara lifted her chin. "I'll last as long as it takes," she said. The colonel's eyes gleamed, not with triumph, but with a strange recognition. The war he had started was no longer about rugs or chores. It was about breaking or proving a spirit. And Clara had just declared she would not break. The colonel thought he had silenced her, but Clara's words lingered long after she and her mother left the study. Walter Mayhew. The name rang through his memory like an old bugle call, pulling him back across the decades to a place he had never escaped. That night, long after the penthouse lights dimmed, Colonel Rothell sat alone in his office. The city sprawled outside the window, glittering with wealth he had conquered, yet in the reflection of the glass, he saw not a CEO, but a young lieutenant again, 21 and bleeding into the mud of Vietnam. The firefight had been sudden and merciless. His platoon was ambushed in dense jungle, bullets shredded leaves, men screamed, and the air itself seemed aflame. Rothell remembered the moment shrapnel tore into his leg, how his body crumpled, useless in the dirt. His radio crackled with dying voices, and he thought, "This is the end. I will be left behind." But Walter Mayhew would not leave him. Sergeant Mayhew, broad-shouldered, steady as granite, had hauled him up like a brother. With one arm he fired back into the trees, with the other he dragged the wounded lieutenant 2 miles through hostile ground. Rothell remembered the blood slicking his uniform, the sound of Mayhew's labored breath, the whispered words, "Stay with me, son. You're not done yet." When they reached the medevac, Mayhew was barely standing, but he grinned through exhaustion and said, "You'll live, so make it count." Then he vanished back into the fight. Hours later, word came through. Sergeant Walter Mayhew had been killed in the counterattack. Rothell lived. Mayhew did not. The guilt had burrowed deep, festering through the years. Rothell returned home, his body healed, but his mind fractured. He built his fortune on discipline, control, and ruthlessness, trying to prove to himself that he was worthy of the life Mayhew had saved. But no matter how much he amassed, money, medals, power, he could never silence the voice that whispered in the night, "Why him and not me?" Now Clara Mayhew's eyes, bright, defiant, carrying the same fire as her grandfather's, cut through the armor he had forged. She didn't even know the weight of the name she carried. She thought she was challenging a tyrant, when in truth, she was summoning a ghost. The next day, Clara brought her school history project to the library, while Ethan pored over his books. It was a report bound in a tattered folder, her handwriting neat and proud. The life of Sergeant Walter Mayhew. The colonel appeared at the doorway. He reached for the folder, his hands trembling despite himself. As he read, Clara's words became knives. She wrote of her grandfather's bravery, his sacrifice, his insistence that honor outlasts victory. She had drawn a picture of his Silver Star medal, shading it carefully. "My grandfather taught me," the paper read, "that real strength is protecting others, even when it costs everything." The colonel's vision blurred. He set the paper down, unable to stop his voice from cracking. "Your grandfather carried me," he whispered almost to himself. "He saved my life. 2 miles. 2 miles through hell." Clara stared, stunned. "You knew him?" The colonel nodded, eyes far away. "He was the best man I ever served with, and I let him die while I lived. I built all of this." He gestured at the penthouse, the empire, the medals on the wall, but it never felt earned. I became harder, crueler, because I didn't know how else to bear it. For the first time, the titan of steel and fury seemed human. His voice faltered, his hand shook, and his mask of authority slipped. Behind it was not just cruelty, but grief, endless, gnawing grief. Clara felt her chest tighten. She remembered the medal her mother kept in a small box, the one her grandfather had left behind. Without thinking, she said, "Grandpa always said the true battle isn't war. It's how you live every day for those who didn't come home." The colonel closed his eyes. Her words struck like a rifle shot, piercing through decades of silence. He realized then that every cruel test, every humiliation, had been his way of punishing others for a guilt he could not release. But now, the granddaughter of the man who saved him stood before him, and for the first time, he wondered if redemption was possible. The penthouse study was dim that evening, curtains drawn against the city's glow. The colonel sat alone, staring at the folder Clara had written. Her words haunted him like jungle echoes. He had faced down enemies with rifles in their hands, but this child's truth had left him defenseless. The door creaked. Clara entered, her small figure framed by the golden light of the hallway. In her hands, she carried a small wooden box. Helen hovered nervously behind her, but Clara stepped forward alone. She placed the box on the colonel's desk. Her voice was quiet, but unshaken. "This belonged to my grandfather." The colonel opened it. Inside, cushioned in faded velvet, lay a silver star. The metal glimmered faintly in the lamplight. His breath caught. It was identical to the one pinned in his display case. His own had always felt like a weight of shame. This one was different, sacred. Clara pushed it toward him. "He wanted me to remember that honor matters more than rank, more than winning. He said the real battle is living in a way that honors those who didn't come back." The colonel's hand trembled as he picked up the medal. For decades he had buried his guilt beneath walls of iron discipline. But holding Mayhew's star in his palm felt like holding the life he had squandered, the man he had never properly mourned. His throat tightened. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "No," Clara said softly, "but you can choose to deserve the life he saved you for." Her words cut deeper than any reprimand. The colonel's eyes burned. For the first time, he felt not defiance in her gaze, but a bridge offered by the granddaughter of the man who had once carried him through fire. He bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he said, the words gravel in his throat. He turned to Helen. "For every cruel order, for every humiliation, I dishonored the man who saved me by treating his family without respect." His voice broke. "Forgive me." Helen's eyes filled with tears, her shoulders sagging with the release of years of fear. Clara reached out, steady and unyielding. If you want forgiveness, honor him by changing, not tomorrow, now. The colonel drew a shuddering breath, and for the first time in decades, the fortress he had built around himself cracked, not under enemy fire, but under the weight of a child's courage and a dead man's legacy. The transformation did not come quietly. The very next morning, the colonel summoned the household staff. They assembled in the marble foyer, maids, drivers, the housekeeper, Mrs. Lawton, whose sneering authority had long echoed his own cruelty. Everyone braced for another tirade, but the colonel's stance was different. His medals gleamed in the morning light, but his shoulders no longer carried the same stiffness. He cleared his throat, the silence hanging heavy. I have built this house, this company, this life on discipline. But discipline without honor is nothing. Yesterday, I was reminded of a man who saved me in war, Sergeant Walter Mayhew, and I realized I have dishonored his memory. Whispers flickered through the staff. Clara and Helen stood to the side, their eyes fixed on him. The colonel's gaze hardened, though not with cruelty this time. He turned to Mrs. Lawton. You have ruled this house through fear and malice. That ends today. You're dismissed. The woman gasped, her lips trembling with outrage. Sir, after 15 years, enough! The colonel cut her off. Leave your keys and go. His voice was final, but no longer brutal. It carried the authority of a man reclaiming control for the right reasons. Mrs. Lawton's face drained of color. She turned on her heel and stormed out, her reign over the household broken. Then the colonel turned to Helen. She stiffened, expecting humiliation, but instead his voice softened. Helen, I have treated you as less than human when you deserve dignity. From this day, you are no longer the maid. You will manage this estate. Your salary will reflect that. And your daughter. He looked at Clara, his voice tightening. Your daughter reminded me what courage looks like. She will have every opportunity I can provide. Piano lessons, tutors, and when the time comes, a college education, fully paid. The staff gasped. Helen pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. Clara's eyes widened, but she didn't smile. Not yet. She wanted to believe this was real. The colonel wasn't finished. Later that week, he stood before the board of his company, men and women who had watched him lead with ruthless efficiency for decades. This time, he didn't arrive with quarterly reports or charts. He arrived carrying a small wooden box. This, he said, opening it to reveal the Silver Star Medal, belonged to Sergeant Walter Mayhew, the man who saved my life. I have spent my years building wealth and power, but I failed to live worthy of his sacrifice. That changes now. He announced the establishment of the Walter Mayhew Scholarship, dedicated to funding education for children of veterans who had given everything. The boardroom, usually a place of icy calculation, filled with murmurs of astonishment. For the first time, their iron-willed leader was not speaking of profits, but of honor. When he finished, he did not ask for approval. He simply said, "It is the least I can do." The scholarship was splashed across newspapers within days. Ruthless CEO honors fallen hero, the headlines read. Investors, expecting outrage, found themselves instead flooded with goodwill from the public. But to the colonel, none of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet nod of approval from Clara when she read the article. That evening, for the first time in years, the penthouse was filled not with silence or fear, but with music. Clara sat at the piano, her fingers tentative at first, then steady, coaxing melody into the vast halls. Helen watched from the doorway, tears on her cheeks. The colonel stood behind them, hands clasped, eyes closed, not as a commander, but as a man finally surrendering to something greater than discipline: peace. The fortress he had built all his life had cracked wide open, and in its place, something new was being born. For years, the penthouse had been silent except for the echo of orders, the bark of reprimands, the shuffle of fearful footsteps. Now, for the first time, it carried a different kind of silence, the quiet of expectation, of something fragile being rebuilt. The colonel began with small gestures. He knocked before entering rooms. He thanked Helen when she brought his tea. He corrected himself when his tone grew too sharp, pausing as though swallowing words that once came easily. These were not grand declarations, but daily battles against the pride that had ruled him for decades. One evening, Helen lingered in the kitchen, wiping down an already spotless counter. The colonel entered, his steps slower, less commanding. For a long moment, he simply stood there, hands at his sides, as though uncertain how to begin. "Helen," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard, "I cannot erase what I have done, but I can change what I do now." Her hands stilled. She looked up, her eyes wary, waiting for the sting behind the softness. But none came. Instead, he bowed his head, a gesture so foreign in that kitchen it felt almost sacred. "I treated you as though your service erased your dignity," he continued. "That was wrong. You kept this household standing, not through fear, but through resilience. You deserved respect every day I denied it." Helen's lips trembled. "Why now?" she whispered. He drew a slow breath. "Because a little girl reminded me that rank without honor is nothing, and I refused to dishonor the man who saved me any longer." Behind him, Clara had appeared, her notebook clutched to her chest. She watched him with cautious eyes, as though testing whether the fortress of his pride truly lay in ruins. The colonel turned to her. His voice shook. "Clara, I cannot repay what your grandfather gave me, but I will honor it. Through you." For a heartbeat, the three of them stood in that kitchen, the maid, her daughter, the man who once ruled them with cruelty. No titles, no commands, no walls of fear. Only the fragile beginnings of family. Later that night, as Clara practiced scales on the piano, the colonel sat in the living room, listening. The music was hesitant, imperfect, but it was more beautiful than the silence that had haunted him for years. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile, not the stiff, rehearsed smirk of a CEO, but the quiet, unguarded smile of a man finally humbled. The fall of pride was not a collapse in shame. It was a surrender into something stronger than command, grace. The weeks that followed unfolded with a gentleness the penthouse had never known. Where once the sound of boots had struck the marble like gunfire, now the halls carried music. Clara practicing her piano, her notes clumsy at first, then confident, then soaring. Helen moved through the rooms without flinching, her posture straighter, her steps lighter. Even the city skyline beyond the glass felt less like a conquest and more like a view of possibility. The colonel had not become a saint overnight. He still woke some mornings with the old shadows clinging to him, the smell of jungle smoke in his dreams, the voices of men he'd lost. But when he stirred from those nightmares, he no longer reached for a cigar or a command to bark. Instead, he would sit in the dark, listening to the faint notes of Clara's piano drifting from down the hall. It became his anchor, proof that he was not doomed to live only in the past. One Sunday morning, Clara placed her grandfather's silver star on the piano. "It belongs here," she said, "where people can see it, where it can remind us to live better." The colonel stood beside her, staring at the medal. He had once kept his own locked behind glass, an emblem of guilt. But this one, Walter Mayhew's, looked different under Clara's hand. It was no longer a weight. It was light, a promise. "Your grandfather saved me," he said quietly, "but you gave me back the reason to live." Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Then honor him by being the man he believed you could be." That afternoon, the colonel signed the final documents for the Walter Mayhew Scholarship. The fund would carry Walter's name long after the colonel was gone, ensuring children of veterans would never be forgotten or discarded. For the first time in decades, when he signed his name, his hand did not tremble. The housekeeper was gone, the fear dissolved. Helen now walked through the estate as its manager, her dignity restored. Clara prepared for her first real piano recital, a small concert in the community hall, where the colonel planned to sit in the front row, not as a commander or a CEO, but as a grandfather in spirit, clapping louder than anyone. And when the lights dimmed at night, the penthouse was no longer silent with ghosts. It was filled with the quiet hum of healing, of a soldier finally laying down his armor, of a maid's daughter daring to stand tall, and of a legacy carried forward not in medals or wealth, but in honor. The story did not end with victory on a battlefield or a hostile takeover in the boardroom. It ended with a man once feared learning that the greatest triumph was not dominance, but redemption. And as Clara pressed the piano keys one evening, the colonel sat listening, his heart at peace for the first time since Vietnam. The fortress had fallen, but in its place rose something stronger, a home